Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the national meeting. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance for the BJA Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. I want to thank everybody for returning. And I know some of you had the opportunity to take advantage of the BJA office hour just before this. So I hope that went well, and I encourage those of you who didn't have the chance to take the opportunity tomorrow, or if questions come up during the day today, feel free to check in with them tomorrow during their office hour before the meeting starts tomorrow. So again, thank you all for your participation. I want to move us directly to Laura McElroy's presentation. Probably several, if not more than several of you know Laura from the work that she's done with us over the past several years on body-worn cameras. I've never seen her give a presentation or have an engagement that wasn't appreciated and that people didn't thoroughly enjoy. So Laura, I know you're going to talk a little bit about your background, so I won't steal that thunder, but we're very glad to have you with us today, and please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Chip. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. Just to tell you a little bit about my background, I spent 16 years in broadcast news as a reporter and an anchor. And then I like to say that I saw the light and I went to work for the good guys. And I went to work for the Tampa Police Department. I did their media relations for 11 years. And I've spent the last 6 years working as a consultant with a lot of the think tanks like CNA, with PERF, with the different law enforcement think tanks that offer help to local agencies. And so I've been involved with body-worn camera for several years now. And so looking at the issue with your policy of releasing video is what I want to talk to you about today, specifically when it involves a critical incident, something that's high profile for your community. I don't have to tell anyone on this meeting that has been a very difficult year for law enforcement, trying to figure out how to police during a worldwide pandemic, dealing with the waves of protests following the death of George Floyd. It's been a very unique and harrowing time for law enforcement. And that segues into my next slide. I'm trying to control my own slides here. My next slide, where something that I've observed over the 17 years that I've worked closely with law enforcement, something that you guys do very well is you plan. You write a plan for just about everything, every eventuality. Then you train on that plan. And when a critical incident happens, then you debrief and you update the plan. But there's one area in law enforcement where I've observed that you typically don't have necessarily a written plan, and that is the public messaging aspect of a critical incident. And so what I do working with law enforcement agencies is help them put together a crisis communication plan. And while I have a 16-step plan that I work with a lot of agencies on, today what I want to do is share with you 6 of those steps, the most basic and necessary steps to try and get in the driver's seat on the messaging when a high-profile critical incident happens in your community. And so before we get started, I thought this would be a good time to whip out the first poll question and have you guys answer it. And that is, when you are a supervisor managing a critical incident, do you consider the public messaging aspect of it as you are making your operational decisions? Is that part of the totality of the circumstances? Is how the community is going to respond, how City Hall is going to respond, how is the media going to respond? Does that become part of your messaging? So we'll move on to the next slide while we're waiting for those results. I think that there's really nothing that underscores the need for a crisis communication plan for law enforcement like what we experienced in the last year. Waves of protests that at this time last year, some communities were still dealing with the protests and the demonstrations. And I think almost no city was exempt, large, medium, small, everyone had some type of pushback in their community. Okay, so here's our results. So 80% do consider the public messaging aspect. I think that's very encouraging, because I think if you are making decisions operationally that take that into consideration, it makes it much easier when you have to explain things to the public. So I think that's very promising that 80% are already putting thought into that side of the decision making. So if we look at the protests from the last year, what can we learn from it? And I think if we go to the next slide, we may be able to take a lesson from the man known as the father of modern policing, Sir Robert Peel. Most of you are probably familiar with this quote: "The police are the public are the police. You guys just happen to get paid for it. But the community is also a critical ingredient in achieving public safety." But I want to share with you on this next slide a less known quote by Sir Robert Peel. And that is, if people speak out against us, if thousands take to the streets and protest, if there's a natural burst of indignation, then instead of arguing with them and fighting back and trying to explain your position and being defensive, that's the time to listen. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see there were some powerful images across the country of agencies that did listen. Here's an officer kneeling down with protesters in Fayetteville, North Carolina. On the next slide, we see officers taking a knee in LA. On the next slide, we see a fist bump in Atlanta. The next slide shows Oklahoma City, a sheriff sergeant hugging a protester, which then the crowd erupted into applause and cheering on seeing that hug. So am I trying to tell you that if you kneel down and pray or hug a protester, it's going to solve all your problems? No. I'm not talking about looting. I'm not talking about lawbreakers. I'm not talking about the communities that were dealing with a lot of violence. I'm talking about the communities that were dealing with a lot of protests. And is there the opportunity to hear them and to learn from them and to empathize? I think the bottom line for law enforcement and what I have learned in my time in working with law enforcement and the community is that the community wants to know that you share their values, that you share their goals and their priorities for their community. And if they feel that, then when they see an officer in trouble who's in a beatdown with a bad guy, or they see an in-progress event in their community, they're much more likely to pick up the phone and text you, tweet you, post you, maybe even call you, but to really start to build that sense of teamwork that is necessary. As we saw from Sir Robert Peel, it takes both. It takes the cops, it takes the community working together to reduce crime, to make the community safe. And then it's really incumbent upon law enforcement to build that sense of trust, to listen, to hear them, and to let them know that you recognize their values. So dealing with critical incidents, at one time, it was pretty straightforward. It was based on the facts. And if was the individual armed? Did that individual threaten the life of a police officer or a community member? And that would be the end of the story. But today, in this world where everything is recorded and everything is shared on social media, where the flow of information is lightning fast, there is a different expectation from the community and a different level of questioning. And that is not only what are the facts, but how are you going to deal with those facts? Are you going to push them out quickly? If there's video, if there's body-worn camera video or cell phone video or surveillance footage, are you going to share it with the community? 911 calls, are they going to be shared? Are you going to share the facts of what has happened? And then the investigation, is it going to be fair? And if someone has violated a policy or a law, will they be held accountable? And on this next slide, the purpose of it is really to share with you that the idea that these expectations are evolving. And here is a quote from Perf saying that these expectations from the public, to be able to see that body-worn camera, to be able to know the facts of what happened when a community member is injured or if a life is taken, that this is a reasonable expectation. And so on the next slide, I ask a series of questions that I think are important to ask yourself as an organization as you're getting ready to write the segment of your policy that deals with releasing video. What does that policy say about your organization? Is it setting a tone that you are open, that the public has a right to know, that you want to share this information with the public, good, bad, or ugly? Does it reflect what the community's expectations are? Do you know what your community's expectations are? Have you engaged with them and talked to them about it? And then therefore can reflect their values and their priorities in the way you develop your policy. And how will it help you with your public messaging when it comes time for dealing with a critical incident? And so I'd like to bring up the second poll now, where the question is about whether or not you have a responsibility to communicate when you're changing or developing a policy, whether it's your body-worn camera policy or it's a new program. Do you have a responsibility to communicate that to the public and to keep them informed? So if we move on to the next slide as we wait for those results to pop up. So handling critical incidents. The bottom line for law enforcement is how you handle a critical incident can make or break you as an organization. You spend all this time working on your relationship with the community, and we all know that can go up in smoke that quickly when a critical incident happens. But if you're very quick in the way you manage it, you have a plan, you execute that plan on your public messaging, you're proactive in what you release, the facts, the video, the footage, whatever is appropriate in that particular circumstance that you can release, that you do it quickly, proactively, and that you show strength. Or even in a worst case scenario, in a shit sandwich, you can actually earn trust with the community for doing the right thing, for policing yourself. But if you are reactive, and the only way that the public gets information is when there's official public records requests made, and so you're reactive to those demands from the community and reactive to the demands from the media, and you come across as disorganized and not willing to release information, well, that's when the media and therefore the public starts to condemn, starts to criticize, starts to second guess, Monday morning quarterbacks, everything that a police officer is doing. I want to share with you an example, but here's our poll results. So 91% say you do have. I'm so impressed. This is such a smart crowd. I love it. So 91% say that you should communicate, whether it's your body-worn camera policy or another policy. This is fantastic because it shows really building that sense of team that is necessary, I believe, to truly build a sense of safety in a community. So let's look at this example of an incident that happened in September of 2020. So it's just a few months after the protests of George Floyd. Things are still very tense in our community, in our country. It's the shooting death of Deon K. So the case starts with officers seeing Deon K and 3 other individuals in a vehicle streaming live on Instagram showing that they are armed. And these are individuals who are known to law enforcement for past offenses. If you click on this slide, you see the images from Instagram. There's a second photo there as well. So these are the images that law enforcement are seeing. The DC cops show up at the location, and within 10 seconds of being at the scene, a shooting takes place. And right after that shooting, immediately the protest started. This is a few hours later after the sun is set, but at the district office, District 7, that's nearby where the shooting took place, they're protesting, and they're also protesting at the mayor's house, calling for the firing of the police chief. The next slide is the video, and we'll just play a quick segment for the first 10 seconds. If you can go back and play it. You're on the wrong slide. Go back. One more back. There you go.
Don't move! Don't move! Don't move! Don't move!
So the video then continues where they're searching for the gun. Kate pitched the gun into the park right after the shooting took place. So the video continues for several seconds. And then if we go to the next slide, they then played a slow-mo version of the same 10 seconds where it's clearly visible with the circle around the firearm that he is armed. And so they played the raw video and then followed it with this slowed down and highlighted the weapon. Now, I'm not going to tell you that made the protests go away. They continued, the protests and the vigil for Deon K. but I believe they help temper the narrative, the comments from the chief, the video where people could see the facts that this individual was armed and did threaten the life of a police officer. And so this, I believe, is an example of releasing the video quickly can be in your benefit. Now, in some circumstances, you're not going to clearly see that the individual is armed, and maybe they're not armed, and that it's a situation where the officer believed that the person was armed and they were not armed. But if the community and the media know and can depend on the agency to always release information, whether it's good, bad, or ugly about the organization, and that builds trust in the organization. They know that they're going to get the facts, they're going to get the information, and they're much more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt if you are releasing the information proactively and consistently in any critical incident. That's the vigil and the protests that remain peaceful after the release of the video. So here's just a series of questions to think about as you're putting together your body-worn camera policy, specifically the section on releasing video. When are you going to release it? How quickly? What's going to be your time frame? Do you edit the video? Are you going to release the raw, or are you going to release the raw and an edited version, or are you only going to release the edited version? What are you going to do with the individual's family members? Are you going to show them the video first? If so, what's going to be the time frame of how quickly you show them the video versus releasing it to the public? If there's special interest groups or key stakeholders that would be involved based on the neighborhood, based on the history in that neighborhood, are they going to be part of your decision process? Are you going to release it to them after the family or with the family? Just making sure that you're thinking about these things as you're developing your policy, because you don't want to be making these decisions on the fly when you're dealing with a critical incident. Okay, so step one on the crisis communications plan is making sure that you have a process in place for monitoring social media when the critical incident happens. On the next slide, I talk about developing a social media team. I developed one in Tampa. We were the first agency in the country that had a team of officers and employees who were the social media team. They're developing organic content of officers out on patrol. It's all the warm and fuzzy feel-good stuff that helps build the relationship with the community. But then they play a very critical role in monitoring social media when the critical incident happens. So as a PIO or as a commander handling a scene, they could call radio, find out who's on social media team that night, and that person is made aware we've just had a shooting and made aware that their role is to monitor that social media. And so that's something that I've helped a lot of agencies establish around the country so that they can be ready and that they can consider the public sentiment when they're making their decisions. Step number 2, which is establishing your agency as the official source of information. On the next slide, we see the first time that an agency did that was the Boston bombing, when Boston PD used Twitter to establish their Twitter account as the official source of information. And this is where the community could get information versus having to rely 100% on the local media. The next slide shows another example, Orlando PD using Twitter when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened. First, establishing that the incident happened, and then second, letting the community know this is where you're going to get information and this is where the official and correct information will come from. And their Twitter following grew exponentially as soon as these tweets went out. This is an example of not just with breaking news, but in an archival format, that it's just as important to be the official source of information on your police activity. If you're Googling something in your community, a critical incident, what does the community find? Do they find the media coverage talking about your incident, or do they also find your news release because they're all archived on your website and an easy to find location on your website, so that the official source, the official facts are out there on a Google search for anyone who's looking, a member of the media or a member of the public. And in Vallejo, on the next slide, you see not only do they release the details of their critical incident, but then they also, on that same page, have the corresponding body-worn cameras, all the different angles that are affiliated with that critical incident. So they are housing the official source of of what happened with this police activity, and that the public doesn't have to rely entirely on the local media. Is step number 3, and the importance of quickly refuting false information. Of course, you have to consider the totality of it, looking at the source of that false information. Are they an influencer on social media? Are they worth responding to? But that's something that needs to be seriously considered. And the benefit of having a team in place is these people are skilled and understand and are knowledgeable about making that decision, helping you make that decision on whether or not to refute. So here's Boston bombing, where the media is reporting that the second arrest was made. And this was the first time we ever saw this in law enforcement, where a tweet came out saying, no, the media doesn't have it right. I know that's a shock to all of you. But in actuality, we haven't caught the second bad guy yet. And then there's the tweet showing when the search was over, the manhunt was over. And the next slide shows an example with the outdoor mass shooting, the outdoor concert mass shooting in Vegas, where the sheriff jumps out front. They tweeted refuting the false information, and then very quickly the chief jumped up and did an impromptu news conference out at the scene. If we play this video, you hear him refuting
multiple phone calls and accusations or conjecture coming through social media that there's multiple shooters at other resorts. That has been proven to be false. Additionally, there has been accusations or
That's fine. We
belief
can
that
stop
there's
it
some
there.
explosive.
So he very quickly jumps out and refutes the false information and contains the rumors and misinformation that can be very destructive. That releasing your body-worn camera can help set the record straight and stop, dispel the rumors and stop the misinformation from being destructive. Step number 4 is the importance of having a very consistent voice that leads the community, that instills calm and strength at a time when people can be afraid. When there's violence in the community, people are going to ask the questions. Is this coming to my doorstep? Are my children safe? Is it going to be okay? Is there going to be more violence? And I really learned this lesson firsthand covering the president during 9/11. He was in Florida for a program with his brother Jeb. And when George W. Bush came out and spoke to all of us in the media and said, we are under attack and you're either with us or you're against us. In that moment, I wasn't a reporter. I wasn't a Democrat. I wasn't a Republican. I was just a person, and I was scared, and I would have followed my president anywhere. And that lesson of that moment when there is violence and people are scared and nervous, that is the time for a leader to emerge. That is the time for the chief to step out front. And in this particular case, where you're seeing here is the former chief in Tampa, Jane Castor, standing with the former mayor after we lost 2 police officers and we had a massive manhunt going on to find the man responsible for taking the lives of those 2 police officers. And we made the decision that they would stand together, whether it was in the station or the headquarters, or if it was out in the field, that the chief and the mayor would be side by side, and that would be our image of strength, that we are in this together as a community and we will catch this bad guy working together. And so that is a very important step that I think often gets overlooked. And that is the importance for a leader to emerge and to bring a sense of calm and security to the community. Here's an example of where a body-worn camera policy actually aggravated the circumstances, but then the voice of calm emerges with the chief and does a really good job of getting things back in check. So this is March 2019, the shooting death of an unarmed African-American male. The officers believed that he was armed, but in the end, he was holding a cell phone. So protests start immediately, and then the chief moves very quickly to release the body-worn camera video. Their policy says 3 days, and he releases it within a day. And after he releases it, the protests don't stop. So the issue is they had not thought through, when developing their policy, of when the officers could mute their microphone. And so you hear them right after the shooting talking to each other saying, mute, 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 turn off your mic. That aggravated the protests that were already taking place. What the chief did to manage it is he made the rounds to all the media outlets. He didn't do the traditional news conference where all the media comes together. He made the rounds on the 10 o'clock news in the evening. And then the next morning, this is the next morning that he's on a morning show, and he is there answering all the questions. Now, he's not going to be able to give them everything they want to know, but he is responding. And so I would ask you, what does that say to the community? When the chief is out front saying, hey, anything you want to ask, I'm going to give you a response. Might not be able to tell you everything you want to know, but you are going to get a response. We have nothing to hide. We have nothing to run from. I stand behind my officers. I stand behind my department, and I stand with the community.
You released the videos yesterday as an effort to make your department more transparent, but you look at what is clearly a lot of anger right now in the streets, and it's hard to say whether that increased trust at all with your department.
Yeah, I think it did, and I think it will continue to do that. But this is a tragic event for our entire community. So yes, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of questions, there's a lot out there that is very emotional. But I have seen some of the conversations change since we've had that video released to the facts of the case as opposed to filling in the facts because there's a void of facts. And so I think that's a positive change. Obviously, people are still very angry, and we expected them to still be angry because they still don't have all the answers, and just releasing the video doesn't change that.
You expected the anger. Do you understand it?
Yeah, I do understand it. But again, I think at some point we have to evolve to where we have a tremendous amount of trust between law enforcement and the community, so people trust that we do a thorough investigation, we'll come to the just outcomes, and clearly we're not there right now because you see what is going on right now, but we will continue to work towards that.
So I think he did an excellent job in this interview and each one of his interviews where he stuck to his key messages. He obviously knew what he wanted to communicate to his community, and he used the local media as a vehicle to get his message out, to be his force multiplier. It was very masterfully done. And most agencies don't want to stand up when they're dealing with a worst case scenario, unarmed black male shot by white cops, worst case scenario. But he is out there front and center, de-escalating the media and de-escalating the community. The points that he earned with the media doing this is immeasurable. So then when an officer makes another judgment call in a dynamic situation, the media now is going to have the position that he's a good guy, that this chief is a stand-up guy who's open and honest and has nothing to hide, and that you can believe him. And so that really works in the agency's favor in the long haul. So step number 5 is when you're wrong, own it. And I know we have unions, and I know we have lawyers, and that means that we have to have tough conversations with the union, with the lawyers, with the city manager, with the mayor, of making sure that you're having those conversations as a leader of the organization, so that you can get out front and deal with the ugly, the things that you don't want to have to talk about. So this is LAPD, April of 2020. This is a use of force incident with a homeless man. The cell phone video goes viral. Okay, I think you get the point. So this is an unarmed homeless man. There's a complaint about his presence, and this is the way the officer dealt with it. LA's policy on their body-worn camera release is that if there is a fatal shooting, an in-custody death, or a use of force that leads to hospitalization, then they are required to release the video. This didn't rise to that standard. The individual was not hospitalized and was treated at the scene for cuts and abrasions. Also, their policy says they must release within 45 days, which is consistent with the state law. But within a week, not only did they do their community briefing on this case, but it was the chief who is addressing it. And so I'd like to play 30 seconds or so of the community briefing.
I am committed to transparency and accountability in this investigation. I feel compelled to release the body-worn video and other information about this incident. I, along with many of you, watched the third-party video that was released last week, and I have serious concerns. Any use of force, justified or not, is difficult to watch, but this one is disturbing. However, one video does not tell the whole story, and I'll not pass judgment on this case until all the evidence is collected, witnesses are interviewed, and the investigation is complete. I've taken steps to protect the interests of the public by removing the officer's peace officer powers, and I've assigned him to home pending the outcome of this investigation. Here's a brief overview of what occurred.
So, and then he goes on to release the body-worn camera video. Now, this officer, within a week, they released the body-worn camera video. Within a month, the state attorney charged this officer with assault. This is a case where the agency went beyond their own policy in order to try to temper the concerns in the community. And so I'd like to bring up the next poll that asks the question of, does your agency currently have a policy on the release of body-worn camera footage with a critical incident? So have you already addressed this, is the first question. And then I'd like to go straight to a second poll question on this very same topic, which is there, if you do have a policy, what is the time frame? Okay, and then step number 6, the final step of the plan, is don't forget about your internal audience, because when it comes to critical incidents, they always feel like the stepchild, that they have to learn about the incident from the local media. And it's important to have a policy in place, or not a policy, but a protocol or best practice in place, where someone is drafting a message from the chief, and then the chief can just look at that message on the fly. And it can't be your PIO, because your PIO has hair on fire at that point when they're dealing with a critical incident. So somebody in the chief's office who has the ability to write can draft a message from the chief. Then the chief can review that, edit it on the fly, and get it pushed out to the internal audience. And that is done simultaneous to doing news conferences and pushing the information out to the general public. Okay, so the first one is 81% do have a policy in place. Okay, that's good. And then let's take a look at the next poll question, which is, what's the time frame on the release? So is there a local ordinance or state law that determines when you release your body-worn camera footage? That's our second question along the topic of releasing video. So the next slide is transitioning into just looking at the different approaches to releasing body-worn camera footage around the country. The first example on the next slide is LAPD. They're the ones that came out with the first community briefings, and a lot of agencies around the country have copied them. I call this the Hollywood Blitz version of your critical incident. So let's just watch a short segment of
He was later identified as Jose Chavez, a 24-year-old resident of Los Angeles. Officers tried to talk with him, but he did not respond to any of the officers' questions. Both of the officers who responded to this call were wearing LAPD-issued body-worn video cameras. These cameras are worn on the chest of the officers and captured the interaction with Chavez soon after the officers arrived on scene. Here's the body-worn video footage from the passenger officer. You are going to see him trying to communicate with Chavez, and he asked Chavez several times whether he was okay. He also asked if he needs any medical attention. Chavez does not respond and instead stands silently in the roadway at a distance.
Hey, bud. Hey. Hey,
Okay.
¿Vives por aquí or what? You live around here?
We can pause it. Okay, so 30% are dealing with a state law or ordinance that regulates the release. And I've worked with Raleigh, North Carolina. I've worked with Durham on, they have a law in North Carolina that says you can't release it without a judge's permission. And really, it's critically important that you have a system set up with the courts that you can do it as quickly as possible, that you have a streamlined process, that you're not dealing with weeks or months before you can get that video out. And I think whether you're having to deal with a union or deal with your internal legal team or dealing with City Hall or dealing with the courts, it's really important to have the conversations on the front end and to kind of clear the way so that when the incident happens, that you're not trying to overcome these big hurdles that are put in place by a statute or an ordinance. Okay, and so then just looking at the time frame, I thought it would be interesting to learn what is the time frame for your organization, whether it's by law or by policy. So if you want to go ahead and answer that question, we'll see the results shortly. So going back to LAPD. So to me, this is beautiful. It's beautiful production values. You have this perfect story of what happened. It's got graphics. It's does cutaways of the cameras, explains about the cameras. There's closed captioning for the audio that's hard to hear. But how many agencies can spend the time and energy and money to put together a Hollywood production of this quality? I would say it would be a pretty tall task for most. And in this time, when you have scrutiny of law enforcement, more scrutiny than what probably most of us have experienced in our lifetime, having this extremely well-produced version of the facts raises the question of, well, what didn't you put in the video? And why do you need such a perfect production to tell your story? What's being left out? So from the PIO perspective, it's like, wow, this is beautiful. This is a great way to tell our story. But from being a former reporter, I look at it and go, it's so well constructed and so well orchestrated that it makes me more suspicious and makes me ask more questions. So I think there might be a happy medium on putting together your own community briefing. Okay, so let's see what our results here are in the poll. So the largest percentage is 16 to 30 days, which trying to manage public messaging, it's obviously ideal to be in that 15 days or less. So you've got the smallest percentage in that area. Oh no, I guess 31 to 45 days. Okay, I'll stop rambling about this poll, but the bottom line is the faster that you can have the option to release it, it benefits you. And then in writing your policy, even if it is the policy to release it within 45 days or 30 days, but that you can still break from that policy and move more quickly like we saw LA do. Okay, so if we go to the next option, so that's LA, that's the perfectly crafted approach to releasing body-worn camera. There's a quote on the bottom of this slide. So the exact opposite of LA would be Seattle. Within 24 hours, they dump everything onto their a portal on their website that the media accesses. That includes the 911 calls. That includes all the video, whether it's body-worn camera, whether it's surveillance footage, photographs of the weapons, and then just very basic facts of what's happened. While this is very swift, and I'm sure it has helped Seattle in building trust in their community, there is less ability to impact the public messaging because there's such a dump of so much information onto that portal. What I see as the happy medium is the next slide, which is Las Vegas. So in Vegas, within one day, the first day, they'll do an initial briefing that is acknowledging that an officer-involved shooting happened, that there's been a death, but they don't get into heavy details at that time. The media and the public have come to know that they will, within 3 days, have a full news conference that will release the totality of the circumstances as much as they can at that point. They'll release the footage, body-worn camera, surveillance footage, if necessary, 911 calls, and tell the story of what happened. And so there's an example on here of one of these live play-by-play news conferences. And these are the photos that were released, the weapon, the image of the individual who was shot. And if we play this short video, you'll see an example.
And this will be his body-worn camera footage.
Copy, is part of the channel for chapter 53 and 411 AX35, the full 6700 North Durango.
Get in front of the car. In front of the car. Get in front of the car right now. This car! Of course! Hands on top of your head. Get in front of the car. Go pursuit! Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Inside! We got 413!
So in this video, slow down, you'll see Russo and the gun in his rear waistband. He pulls it out with his right hand and comes back and points it back at Officer Burr. And that's when Officer Burr fired his weapon. Here's some still shots of while the foot pursuit. You can see the gun in his rear waistband. Now we'll open
So
up to any questions.
this to me is the happy medium between Seattle and LA. Obviously, LA's is extremely well done, and I don't want to be overly critical of what they've established with the community briefings. But this live play-by-play takes out the Hollywood glitz factor and eliminates the question or the suspicion that can be aroused by the media if it's too well produced. Here it's live. They've slowed it down. They show the raw so you can see the full thing, but then they slow it down and then they have the stills as well. And so that play-by-play in the moment of a leader of your organization, letting the community, letting the media see exactly what happened can be extremely useful. And so the next slide is just kind of a wrap up of when you're dealing with a high profile critical incident that you want to be monitoring your social media, acting as quickly as possible to establish yourself as the official source of information. And then that puts you in a position to refute false information, to be able to contain misinformation that can be destructive and can incite crowds and potentially protesters in your community. And then when things didn't go well, that you are proactive, and that if you need to, that you own it and get out in front of it in a proactive way, even when it's not pretty for the organization. And then remembering to communicate to your internal audience, and that the entire focus is not just external messaging, but incorporating into your plan a means for communicating with your internal audience. And then practicing this with smaller incidents. When we built out our crisis comms plan in Tampa, we would shut everything down, all of our normal sources of communicating to the media on something much smaller. Maybe it's a weather event that we have, tropical weather threatening our area. And so we would shut down our normal means of communication and then tell the media and the community everything will come out of Twitter. And then we would test it and we would run through and use it for smaller incidents. So then we were conditioning the media and conditioning the public to know when something significant happens in Tampa, we have a process for you to get information. And so practicing it on smaller incidents is extremely useful. So the first time you're using your comms plan is not during a real high profile controversial incident. And the bottom line on the last slide is we are just as strong as our relationship with the community, and how you implement your body worn camera policy, your program can have a big impact. It can be a useful tool for building that trust and building support for your officers, and just making sure that you're leveraging your program and using it to your benefit to communicate with your community. And at that point, I would open it up for questions.
Thanks, Laura. We do have a couple questions that have come in. One of them is, should our department have an agreement with external partners like the mayor's or prosecutor's office to get on the same page prior to releasing the footage?
Yes, I think that's critically important to have that dialogue on the front end, because those conversations might take multiple sessions. Meeting with the mayor's office, meeting with the mayor's communications office, meeting with your prosecutor, your union, having that dialogue on the front end. It might take, multiple sessions to get on the same page. And if you're trying to do that during a critical incident, then it slows down the whole process and you lose the ability to manage or control in any way the public messaging. The importance of moving quickly when the critical incident happens cannot be emphasized enough. And so anything that you can do on the front end to clear the way is really to your benefit.
Thank you. Another question is, what have you seen regarding how agencies deal with letting family members view videos of critical incidents?
I have seen where they bring the family in to see the footage first or take it to the family to be very beneficial, because they are going to have lots of unanswered questions. They're going to have a very emotional response. And if that emotional response is in their home alone, without any support from law enforcement, without anybody there to be able to answer their questions, to show empathy, compassion, and concern, that they're in their vacuum by themselves, then those difficult feelings very quickly turn to anger. And that anger is pitted against the police department. But if you're there showing them the footage and explaining to them what maybe is not explained in the footage, as you know, lots of times the footage doesn't tell the whole story. But if you take the time to sit down with them and explain it to them in their hour of need, when they are in crisis, when they are in grief, that you're willing to answer their questions and willing to be there with them, that goes a long way. Is it going to work every time? Probably not. I've seen organizations where they do the right thing. The chief goes to their house, sits down with the people, and the people still end up coming out critical of the agency. But you have a much better chance of building some support for your officers and also comforting that family and having some communion of both the community and the agency if you take the time to do that. We had an incident once where we shot the bad guy and the hostage, and the hostage survived. And she gave a quote to the paper saying, why didn't they just shoot him in the leg? And then none of this would have happened. And he wouldn't have taken me hostage. And so we went to her house and we picked her up and we brought her back to the agency and we explained to her, we don't shoot people in the leg. This is how it works. And so then when the media came and interviewed her, she thanked the officers for saving her life. And so just by informing them and keeping them up to date on what's happening and understanding police actions, that can definitely work in your favor.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate, and I know we all do appreciate you coming and presenting to us today. It's always a very well-attended session. So thank you so much. And we'll definitely have this recording posted live on the Body-Worn Camera TTA website within the next few weeks.